We start out with such love and affection for our child. We want everything to go well. We're so excited as parents. We think we're going to have such success. We have such high hopes, such positive attitude about parenting. And then as time goes on, things change a little bit. And we start to have more conflicts with our kids. And issues occur. And then before we know it, we have tremendous challenges with our kids. And things start looking like this. Where did we go wrong? Where did we make our mistake? We're going to talk about that today, and we're going to come up with effective strategies to help you deal with power struggles with your child. Let's talk about why power struggles occur. The first thing that you need to think about is the process of individuation. Our children are all born with the innate need to individuate and separate from mom and dad. This is very important for their survival. Think about it. When they become adults, they have to have all of the skills necessary to survive on their own. And so this process of individuation starts very early. A lot of times we think about it starting in adolescence, but the truth is it begins shortly after kids develop language. Think about when they discover the word no. That's basically when it begins. They want to individuate. They want to have a sense of their self. They have a natural urge to have control over their choices. It's their developmental destiny, and we need to learn how to support and strengthen this instead of fighting it. The other very important factor, and this is huge, is, and this is, I think, true for most of us, is as parents, we have a need to be in control. It's very important to us. Think about when you're at the grocery store and you see some kid acting out, you think, boy, that parent doesn't have it together. They need to be in control of that child's behavior. We kind of come to parenting with that attitude that we must maintain control. It's often a definition of a good parent, right? Parent that's able to control their kid's behavior. And to many parents, interpreting their child's resistance as defiance or lack of respect for authority only fuels our conflict. And so as parents, we need to give up on the concept that we can make our children do what we want them to do. Instead, we need to learn how we can inspire, teach, influence, lead, guide, motivate, stimulate, and encourage our children towards positive choices and cooperative behavior. This is a very different strategy than most of us employ. And this is what I want you to really think about today, making this dramatic shift in the way that you perceive parenting and the way that you deal with conflict and power struggles at home. Negative attention seeking is another huge factor in all of this. And keep in mind that children need attention just like they need food and water. If they don't have it as young children, they can develop profound psychiatric illnesses that will last all their life, like reactive attachment disorder. And so it's very important that we become aware of this dynamic. We train our children, believe it or not, we train our children to seek our attention through acting out. Let me say that again. We actually train our children to seek our attention through acting out. The reason for that, and we don't waste any time. We start when they're born and we bring them home from the hospital to that beautiful nursery. We set up that remote monitor in their room. When we hear them cooing and happy, we feel good. When we hear them crying, we go in to see what's wrong. And before too long, our kids start crying more and more because we're teaching them to cry. We're reinforcing that behavior with our attention. And so the more we allow that dynamic to occur, and this occurs in every household. Think about it. Think about the child that tries to get your attention positively. You're busy with something, and then they act out, right? The phone rings, and then all of a sudden they need your attention, and they start acting negatively to get it. They know that it works. They know that it's effective. And so the trick, which we're going to talk about more today, is we have to make this shift. The shift from them learning to get our attention negatively to learning to get our attention positively. This is a very important component to what we're going to talk about today. I also want to mention the idea of what's sometimes referred to as the power drunk child. I've met kids like this. I hope you don't have a child like this. But if you do, your child is so full of manipulation, power, and control that they run the roost. They're in charge at home, not the parents. I see this a lot in my practice, quite frankly. And I take parents through a process that I call dethroning the child and changing the dynamics at home to where the parents once again are in charge, not the kids. This can be a very, very challenging situation, and the consequences can be severe. And so it's something that we really want to think about, because these kids learn through their behavior and observation that by throwing their weight around, it gets them what they want or gets them out of things they don't want. Every time they win through this kind of manipulation and power play at home, it reinforces that behavior and it only gets stronger. It can create tremendous problems at home, tremendous problems between siblings, tremendous problems in terms of schoolwork. It's no small matter. And so it's very important to correct this alignment of authority within the family. There are many examples that I can give you of power drunk kids. I'll give you just a couple just to give you a general idea of what I'm talking about. One of the more common ones is around homework battles, right? A lot of us experience this. And what happens with homework battles is, and it's mind-boggling, our kids spend more time avoiding the homework, giving us a hard time than it would take to actually finish the homework, right? I think a lot of us are familiar with that. And the reason is, over time, our kids have learned that this is a great way to get our attention. Consider the fact that if we develop a system where we're training our kids to get our attention positively, these behaviors change because they're not reinforced. I once met with a boy years ago, and his issue was he liked to get his own way, not just at home, but in school. And so if anyone did anything that he didn't like, he would bite them. At school, he sometimes, when he didn't feel like being in class, he would go outside, climb a tree, and make animal sounds. This is a true story. This kid was power drunk. And so when I worked with this family, we had to completely undo that, shift from negative attention to positive attention. And believe it or not, we had really positive results. So we're going to talk about those strategies as well in a bit. The other thing I want you to keep in mind about kids that are so focused on power at home is that sometimes it's a function of family dynamics. Sometimes there's one or more adults in the household who are also into power and control, and it becomes a battle for power. And so sometimes we as individuals have to address some of our own issues as well as we address some of the dynamics at home that might be fueling this behavior. Which leads me to the last bullet on this page, other considerations. Keep in mind, if there's significant marital conflict or couple conflict at home, it's going to fuel all kinds of dysfunctional behaviors on the part of the children, including arguments and power plays and issues around struggling for control. And so we need to kind of make sure our house is in order. We need to make sure that both parents are on the same page in terms of discipline with their children and not at counter purposes. This is a larger conversation, but keep in mind that it's important for parents as best they can, and none of us do it perfectly, to be on the same page, for the kids to know that there isn't an easy parent to ask the question to as compared to the more challenging parent. We have to kind of mix the good cop, bad cop role within ourselves and not allow that to be a dynamic in terms of parents and their behavior towards their children. The other issue that's significant that we have to be concerned about as well are individual issues, emotional and behavioral challenges that we might have in ourselves, we might have in our children. For example, many of you who have children that have ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, may also experience oppositional behavior at home. The reason that I know that is that with children that are diagnosed with ADHD, they often have comorbid disorders or additional disorders. And the most common one is oppositional defiant disorder. And let me tell you why. Typically, this is because the children that are diagnosed with ADHD have a lot of impulsivity. And as you probably know, there are different kinds of ADHD: inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive, combination of the two, etc. For kids that have some of the impulsive issues with ADHD, they tend to act before they think. This is a dangerous thing. and it creates a lot of conflict. Imagine a world where people just acted without thinking. It would be total anarchy out there. And so if your child has ADHD or other behavioral emotional challenges that are significant, we really need to address those first, because the techniques that I'm going to talk about today will certainly be effective to some degree, but we have to deal with some of those underlying issues when they're significant. If they're not significant, we should see very good benefit to the techniques that we're going to talk about today. The other thing to keep in mind is poor anger control. And I see a lot of kids and adolescents who come in because of anger issues at home and sometimes at school too, but it's usually at home. This is a whole nother treatment issue. And if a child has significant anger issues, then we clearly need to help them and teach them anger management techniques. Because again, if their anger control issues are significant, it's going to compromise our parenting strategies that we'll be discussing today. I want to just take a moment to talk about children and anger, because there's something that most parents don't know that I want them to be aware of. Isn't that a great picture? The little known fact that anger in children may be an indicator of underlying depression. Think about that, because it's not something we think about as parents. When our kids are angry, we discipline them, we get upset with them. It never crosses our mind that maybe there's some underlying depression. But I can tell you that in approximately half of the cases that I deal with, when I get a referral for a child that has anger problems, it is because of underlying depression. We can actually make the diagnosis of depression in children and adolescents without depressed mood, believe it or not, if we have a significant degree of irritability. And this is because children aren't really able to deal with their feelings at a young age, and they'll often just act out in anger. Excuse me. And so it's very important that we assess for depression as well, because if we just treat the anger, we're not going to be dealing with the underlying depressive symptoms. And I just want you to take a look on the right side of your screen. These are some of the basic symptoms of depression that you want to be aware of. Notice the first one says sad or irritable mood. Sometimes we see a loss of interest in activities once enjoyed, changes in eating or sleeping, slow or agitated movement, a loss of energy, feeling worthless, feelings of guilt, difficulty concentrating. This is very important too, because I do psychological testing as well in my practice, and it is not uncommon for me to test kids. Everyone is convinced that they're ADHD, the teacher, the parents, the child themselves. Sometimes I've tested kids who are on ADHD medication for years, only to find out that it wasn't ADHD at all. And depression is one of the possible alternate explanations. Anxiety is very common as well. And so, we want to be thoughtful about diagnosis and being clear about what the challenges that our kids have. So only then can we address them effectively. Last but not least, of course, frequent thoughts of death or suicide would be another warning sign of depression. This is the most important slide that I'm going to show you today. I want you to look at this slide. I want you to think about this slide and consider the idea, for lack of a better name, of Zen parenting. Now, I apologize to Buddhists everywhere. I'm not an expert in Zen Buddhism by any means, but I like the phrase Zen parenting because it really zeroes in on the dramatic shift that we have to make to profoundly change the power struggles that we have at home. What happens when we have power struggles is we get emotionally hooked into it, and that's where the trouble begins. Think about all the times that you were angry with your children and you said like crazy consequences that didn't even make sense 5 minutes later. We all do this. Nobody is better at pushing our buttons than our lovely children. And so we have to really rethink how we approach conflict. And I want you to consider the ideas, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a moment, of detachment and disengagement. Detachment and disengagement when faced with conflicts with our kids. That's the idea behind what I'm calling, for lack of a better name, Zen parenting. And I want to do a little training with you right now. Right now. It'll take a few minutes. I'm just going to remove that Zen parenting. And I want you to stare at this picture, this beautiful image. And I want you to imagine yourself in that chair. Now, before we start, I want you to think right now how stressed you are. Think about it on a scale of 0 to 100. 0 not being stressed at all, 100 being super stressed. Write down that number, 0 to 100, how stressed you are right now. We're going to come back to that at the end of this exercise. Picture yourself sitting in that beautiful chair, staring out at the water, looking at those mountains. Imagine yourself there in that chair. And as you look at that scene, I want you to take a deep breath in through your nose, filling your lungs with clean, fresh air, and then exhale slowly through your mouth until all of the air is gone. And when you're exhaling, think about letting go of all the worries and stressors of the day. We're going to do this one more time. Imagine yourself sitting in that chair. Take that deep breath in through your nose. Hold it for a second. Breathe out slowly, letting go of all the worries and troubles of the day. And just look at that beautiful image. Imagine yourself being in that chair. Now I want you to revisit that scale, 0 to 100. 0, you're not stressed at all. 100, you're super stressed. I know I did this very quickly, but I'm hoping for many of you, you will notice a difference. Maybe it's a slight difference. The point of this exercise is that you have a lot more control over the amount of subjective stress that you're experiencing than you realize. And so this is something that's going to be a very powerful ally for you moving forward, not just in terms of discipline and conflict and your children, but life. We tend to get way too stressed, get way out of control with anxiety, and we need to dial it back. And I'm telling you that you have the ability to do so with practice. With practice. Moving on. Let's talk about what the word discipline means to you. For most of us, if we're honest, discipline means punishment. It means punishment, but that is not the true definition of discipline. As you may or may not know, and if you look up discipline, you'll see what I'm talking about. The definition of discipline is to teach appropriate behavior. We go to a place of punishment. This ties into all of the negative attention seeking that we talked about earlier. And you can see in some of the pictures that I provide on this slide, our typical experience of discipline, right? Yelling at our kids, screaming at our kids in some cases. The calm, serene gentleman with the chalk in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen is the only slide that really fits with the true definition of discipline. Teaching appropriate behavior. And that's a big part of what we're going to be talking about today as well. Specific ways that we can teach good conflict resolution, appropriate behavior, how to deal with conflict at home with our kids. Now let's talk about some different strategies, ways that you can engage your child in conflict resolution. And we're going to talk about this in a little while again, but a lot of this has to do with the idea of empowerment, empowering your child, involving them instead of dictating to them. That's a big shift that we have to make. We have to make it not just for our own sanity, but it's the only way that our kids really learn the skills that they need to cope, the problem-solving skills, the anger management skills, the conflict resolution skills. They need to be involved in the process so that they learn these skills instead of us doing it for them, especially as they get older, especially when they're adolescents. But it's never too early to start. So let's talk about some different conflict resolution skills that we can do with our kids. The first is teaching problem-solving skills. Now, I have a very simple sort of 5-step process that we can use to teach problem-solving skills. And let me just mention them to you now. First, step 1, we have to identify what the problem is. And this sounds simplistic, but it's actually very important because a lot of times, and I'm sure you've had this experience, we'll be upset, we'll be in a bad mood, and we don't even know why. And it's really helpful in those situations to sort of trace it back, right? To figure out what it is that we're upset about so that we can then deal with it, put it in perspective, etc. Sometimes we don't even do that. So the first step, which is very important, is to identify the problem. The second step, which actually can be fun, and this is a fun exercise that you can do with your kids, is to brainstorm possible solutions. Remember, when we're using brainstorming, any idea is good. And so if your child is brainstorming with you, you don't want to criticize or analyze what they share. You want to jot it down. Writing it down is very effective. And so we've identified the problem, and now we're brainstorming possible solutions. When you're doing this, try to listen more than talk. Try to have your child come up with as many possible solutions as they can think of, and only when their ideas are exhausted, add some of your own. All ideas are acceptable. All ideas should be written down. When we've completed this process, the next step is to go through our list and for each of those possible solutions, discuss together what the probable consequence or outcome would be if we implemented that solution. So if your child is bringing up an issue of some conflict with peers and one of his solutions is to punch the kid in the face, this is our opportunity to say, well, but let's think about what the consequence of that would be. Obviously, it wouldn't be positive. So we go down our list of possible solutions. We write the consequences, the likely consequences for each. And once we've completed that, we go to step 4, which is to choose our best solution and implement it. Choose the best solution and implement it. And then last but not least, see how it worked. Did it resolve our problem? If it did, great. If it didn't, we go back to our list and kind of look for the next best solution. A lot of kids that have issues around anger management, around poor conflict resolution, have poor problem-solving skills, right? They go to sort of a negative acting out behavior because they don't have the repertoire to choose from more appropriate, healthy options that will not only create less conflict, but increase the likelihood of them resolving the problem, of getting what they want. And so we really want to help our kids to learn these problem-solving skills, to practice them. The more we practice them, the more automatic they will become. The other technique, which is extremely effective, and I really encourage you to try this as well, is using behavioral contracting. Behavioral contracting is super effective. I've used it for many, many years in my practice. And the way behavioral contracting works is really just it's sort of like a formal written agreement, in this case between parents and child, about some behavioral issue that's going on that we want to improve or reduce. Now, I have to tell you, the time for behavioral contracting is not in the middle of the argument. It's a little late then. But we want to wait for a positive time to discuss this behavior that's probably occurred many times before and talk about some possible agreements of what we're going to do next time these things happen. And it would be great to have a lot of positive consequences in there, not just punishments. And it's also an opportunity to have a good discussion, again, at a positive moment about this behavior, this repetitive thing that keeps going on. And so with behavioral contracting, we have a really good conversation. We try to identify the problem. We try to identify some solutions that we will employ when the problem occurs and what positive or negative consequences therein we might use. And we write it down. We want it to be simple. We want it to be clear. And we want it to be something that's mutually agreeable. So it requires a little negotiation, a little compromise. Again, put to use as many of your child's ideas as you possibly can. Once you've come up with the structure for the behavioral contract, you want everyone to sign it. And I know this seems like a goofy formality, but it's very important because it indicates agreement. And then you want to take this contract and put it in a conspicuous place. Maybe it's on the refrigerator door. Maybe you make a copy for your child to have as well. And it's something we can then refer to. The next time that behavior occurs, we can refer to the contract and work the contract. If at that time the child is like, oh, this contract is dumb, I don't like these ideas anymore, well, we can revise it for next time, but this is what our agreement was. So unfortunately, we have to stick to it now. But for next time, we can always talk about revising it. We should always be open to that, revising the behavioral contract. Let's talk about choices. Choices is an interesting thing because if you look online, you'll see a lot of suggestions about offering choices. Choices are good, and they are good. But, we don't want to overwhelm our kids with choices, and we certainly don't want to give choices when no choice is involved. When it's time for bed, it's time for bed. And so we have to be careful about how we use this option. But it's really great to offer kids choices because that's empowering as well. It gets them actively involved in deciding about their behavior, learning how to respond to behavioral challenges, etc. And choices is something else that we want to talk with our child, not create for our child. We want to have discussions about it. One example is, kids have to complete their homework every night, but we can offer choices as to exactly when and where they do the work, as one example. I want to mention to you that I have a little ebook that I put together that really focuses on the idea of behavioral contracting. It will give you a lot of structure, clear steps to follow to develop behavioral contracts at home. It also will talk about using your most powerful reinforcer, which is your time and attention. I really like when parents use any kind of rewards with their kids. I don't like when it's things or candy because novelty effect, those wear off. What your child really wants is quality time with you. That's actually why they're engaging in the negative behaviors, believe it or not, because that's the only way they know to get your attention. And so part of the book, the ebook, talks about that and talks about using what I call structured activity rewards so that your child can earn fun time with mom and or dad and or the family by engaging in appropriate behavior. There's also a link that you can go to our website and see many clinical case examples where we've used these techniques very effectively, including some of the examples that I mentioned to you earlier. So if you'd like to get my free ebook, all you need to do is email one technique that you've tried from this webinar and how it worked out. And just email that to info@boulderpsychologicalservices.com. That will come directly to me, and it'll be my pleasure to send you an electronic version of my ebook entitled Change Your Child's Behavior in 30 Days. Now let's talk about how we can improve our communication strategies with our children. This is a key set of ideas that will help us to dramatically reduce power struggles. Some of these things we've touched on, but now we're going to focus a little bit more on these issues right now. I also want to mention that I haven't seen any action in that chat box. Maybe it's because my webinar is so captivating, but I would love to get feedback. So if you have a chance, let me know what you think as we move forward. The first idea that I want to talk about is this idea of focusing more on listening. Most of us aren't that great at listening, I'm sorry to tell you. And so this is something that's great in terms of communication with anyone, but particularly in terms of communicating with our kids and specifically around reducing conflict. The example I like to use when I discuss this idea of listening is the typical experience that many parents have had where their child comes home from school. They had some kind of negative interaction. Maybe it was with another child, maybe it was with a teacher, and they're very upset. And they come home and they start telling us about their upsetting experience at school. Being good parents, we kind of try to offer them solutions and say, well, did you talk to the teacher? Did you try saying, I'm sorry? And, we do this with the best of intention. But somehow, the more we offer these pearls of wisdom to our child, the more upset our child now is becoming with us. And it's always a little confusing as a parent, like, wow, I'm trying to help you, Johnny, and now you're giving me a hard time? What's that about? Maybe we run into issues around, I just noticed we had something on our chat box about power struggles over homework. and that her kids would rather play on their iPads. And so, simple idea is work before play. And that could be something that's structured into a behavioral contract, where the agreement is depending on the schoolwork and if it's done well and if it's done within the allotted time and place. And we want to be specific again about what we're looking for, that maybe as a reward, our kids can play on their iPads. Never a good idea to say, okay, you can play on your iPad for a little bit more, but then you have to do homework. Because think about it, if any of us had that where we could get paid and not go to work, we wouldn't be showing up. So we need to kind of keep that going where work and then play. Back to listening. We want to be better listeners. And so when we're having conversations with our kids, the rule that I give parents is when you're having a conversation with your child, try to have the situation be that they do most of the talking, that they talk more than you do, which is almost impossible. But shoot for that goal. Whether it's a general conversation or more importantly, whether it's a discussion about behavior issues. I've noticed that we always have problems with homework where you'd rather play on your iPad instead of getting the work done. Tell me a little bit more about what that's about for you. I want to understand it a little bit better. We all appreciate that, an opportunity to explain things, an opportunity to express our feelings. We don't do that enough with our kids. We need to be better listeners. One way to be a more effective listener is to use what's called assertive communication. And what that means, my definition of it, is that we are expressing our feelings, but doing it in a diplomatic way. And so it usually involves some reflection. Johnny, I know that you're frustrated with me because I'm asking you to sit down and do your homework now, but I feel frustrated too because this is something we talked about. And, we really need to come up with a solution. Usually we just have the second part of the conversation. We don't usually start by saying, I understand that you're feeling fill in the blank about the situation, but here's how I feel. It shows respect, which is on our screen as well. And sometimes we're wrong. And that's an opportunity for the person we're speaking to, in this case, our child, to correct us. No, I'm not feeling this way. I'm feeling that way. And that's good information to have. And so we want to use assertive communication. And it's a respectful kind of communication. I mentioned briefly the idea of detachment earlier. And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about the idea of detachment. We want to practice the art of detachment. A parent needs to remain emotionally cool and calm. Without parental anger, there will be no power struggle because the child will have no one to fight against. Think about that. The reason we get into power struggles with our kids is we get into the power struggle. Maybe we don't make a conscious choice in that regard, but we need to be more in control of our anger, of our temper, of our mood. That's why I wanted us to sit on that dock and stare at the water. Because when you're getting into conflict with your child, I want you to remember that slide. I want you to remember that slide, and I want you to detach as much as you can emotionally and do that breathing and think about a relaxing place for a moment and dial down that level of stress and practice this idea of detachment. When we're setting limits with kids, the less emotional we are, the better. And so this is a very effective strategy of just trying to remain calm and be detached emotionally. And when our kids are yelling and screaming about how upset they are, we can use assertive communication. I know that you're feeling very angry right now because you can't play with your friend, but it's time for homework. And to just be detached with that emotionally. I know it's tough. I have a daughter. I failed at it many times. Let me give you one embarrassing example, if I may. I just talked to my daughter about this the other day. My daughter's now 28. But when she was in high school, she went to Boulder High. And one night, she explained to me that some young man that I never met was going to pick her up and drive her somewhere. And I said to her, I'm not comfortable with that because I don't know this boy. And she said, well, he's coming over and I'm going with him. And I said, well, no, that's not okay. You're not going to go with him. And then what happened, much to my surprise, several minutes later, The boy pulled up to the front of our house. My daughter breezed out of the house and got in his car. Now, I have to tell you, in this moment, I felt possessed. I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't reviewing my parenting strategies that I tell everybody else to do. But I can tell you in that moment, what ended up happening is fairly calmly, I'm happy to say, I went right out, opened the car door, extracted my daughter from the car. You should have seen the look on this poor boy's face, who was sort of a victim of all of this, and escorted her back into the house, gave her a consequence in terms of some grounding. And, we never had that problem again. But I wish I had listened to my own webinar, because I bet I could have done a lot better. I mention this example just because I know parenting is an impossible job to do well. I know that. I'm not suggesting that you're going to be in control all the time. But trust me when I tell you, you use these strategies, take them seriously, you're going to see tremendous benefit. And the name of the game is not perfect parenting, because nobody will get there. The name of the game is reducing the intensity and the frequency of our negative conflicts with our kids. That's an achievable, realistic goal. And that's what I'm talking about here today. And that's where these strategies are going to really serve you well. Let's talk about the power of disengagement next. Disengagement is such a cool thing. I love giving this example with disengagement. And if you have a young child, try it, because it's so interesting to see it unfold. If you have a child, especially a young child, who engages in tantrums, right? Tantrums are like the most horrific negative behavior that we get from our kids. And if you've ever seen a kid tantrum, it almost seems seizure-like. It's almost like a medical condition. I mean, it is out of control. But here's what I want you to try the next time your child has a tantrum. Calmly walk out of the room. Don't say anything. Just walk out of the room and see what happens. Because what will happen is your child, who's engaging in this bizarre situation with all of these things going on, will take that circus to wherever you are and then engage in the tantrum there. And if you move to another room, they'll take it to the other room, because it's all about your attention. If you're not giving them attention, it's not worth it to them. And the reason they engage in all these negative behaviors is they know it will get your attention. And we've accidentally trained them to do so, which is the craziest part. And so disengagement is huge. And when I say disengagement, I'm talking about walking away, not yelling and walking away, taking a few deep breaths, saying to your child, we'll discuss this later, and walking away. Sometimes I call this idea, it's a little bit of a variation on a theme, but mutual timeout. Mutual timeout involves saying to your child, you know what, this is very upsetting what's happening now. I'm going to go sit in my room and relax and calm down. I want you to do the same. And then in 5 minutes, we're going to talk about it. Because believe it or not, it only takes 5 minutes to kind of dial down and de-escalate from that anger if we're smart enough to disengage. So disengagement is something that I really want you to think about. And it ties into the idea of choosing your battles, right? We talk about that a lot with parenting. So consider that. Consider disengagement. I just want to talk a little bit about warnings and reminders, if I may. I like the idea of giving kids a heads up and giving kids a warning. If this behavior continues, then the consequence is going to be X, Y, and Z. I'm going to give you a little amount of time to think about that and regroup. We never do that. That's a smart strategy. If your kid is smart, they'll take advantage of it. And so it's nice to sort of forewarn about consequences, especially negative consequences, and give your child an opportunity to shift their behavior and do the right thing. I also like reminders, but a lot of parents make the mistake of reminding their kids too many times. I can't tell you how often I've heard from parents asking me about, I have to tell my child 10 times before they'll do something. The reason is you ask them 10 times. You've trained them to wait. How crazy is that? I like the idea of 3. And so if I make a request of my daughter, especially when she was younger, I could live with 3 reminders. And I would say the first one was, please clean up your room. And then a little while later, I would say, I'm reminding you, you need to clean up your room now. And then the third time, I would say, if your room is not clean, we're going to have to talk about a consequence. Now, a lot of times my child would say, well, what's the consequence, right? Because they want to weigh out, is it worth it or not? And that's when I would use what I call the mystery consequence, where I would say, well, I'm not going to tell you what the consequence is, but if you want to find out, keep doing it. And you kind of, give them a serious look. They kind of give you a serious look back. More times than not, that works. Sometimes you have to come up with the consequence. And if you do, don't make it too crazy, but something significant. And then you'll be amazed at how quickly you can retrain your children in terms of this issue of reminders. Reminders are good, but we don't want to remind them too many times. I hope that makes sense. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's one of the most important things I'm going to share with you today. The idea of respect. We expect respect from our kids, but for reasons that I cannot fully explain to you, we don't necessarily treat children with respect. You know that expression, respect your elders. I think we all agree with that, right? But it implies that you don't have to respect people that are younger than you. It's like disrespect your youngers. I don't know if that's if that's grammatically correct. But respect is a two-way street. And it's important for us to treat even our little tiny children, even when they're very young. They're human beings, and it hurts when we're not being treated respectfully. And so we want to try to operate from a place of respect with our kids. And again, for reasons that I cannot explain, I'm as guilty of this as anyone. We don't typically do that with our young children. We need to do that because we're modeling. And if we don't treat them respectfully, we're modeling an inappropriate behavior that then they're going to mirror back to us. And so we really want to think about this. How respectful are we treating our kids? They deserve our respect, don't they? Last but not least, on this slide, I wanted to talk about timing. And what I really wanted to focus on with this is the idea of we can have so many productive conversations with our kids about their troubling behaviors, but unfortunately, we tend to do it at the worst moment. At the worst moment, when we're all upset, they're upset, and it doesn't go well. We want to make a mental note that this is a recurring problem and something that we want to have a conversation with our child about, but we want to do it at a positive moment, when we're both in a good mood, when things are going well. Sometimes it's in the car, which is weird. We have a lot of profound conversations with our kids in the car. But, it could be like, hey, let's go out for a hot chocolate and talk about, how you're always fighting with your sister. And let's kind of figure out together. Maybe we can come up with some ideas. It's a positive thing. It's not a threatening thing. I'll never forget with my daughter, again, being the imperfect parent that I am, almost without exception, when I would say to my daughter, Jessica, I need to talk to you. She would always say, what did I do wrong? You see what I mean? I trained her to expect some kind of negative consequence, despite what I know. And if I'm doing it with what I know, how are you supposed to do it 100% of the time? Make these changes, chip away at them. One little change is everything. I'm not expecting you to dramatically become the perfect parent. You shouldn't expect that of yourself either. But what I am suggesting is make these little changes, put some real effort into it, because habit change is not easy. All these ideas sound very simple today, but believe me, it takes effort and practice before you can really start to shift those behaviors. Put the time into it. It'll pay off for you in a big way. Let me get back to this idea of empowerment. It's so important, and we don't like to use it. The idea of empowerment says that our kids should have a voice in the discipline plan. Ooh, scary. I don't know if I want to give up that power. You want to share that power. You want to share that power yesterday. Again, because your kids have to learn to deal with these challenges on their own. And as you may know, they grow up fast. When they're 18, 19, they leave the house. They're making decisions for themselves. The only way to help them to be responsible for their behavior as young adults and adults is to use empowerment strategies. Because empowerment strategies will allow your child to engage in the actual behaviors that they need to practice. And so if you're having an issue with your child doing homework, it's important to have that conversation and empower them and say, look, this is your homework, not mine. How can I support you with it? How is it you want to deal with this homework? Let's talk about some problem solving around it like we discussed. Let's generate and brainstorm some ideas together. If your child is involved in the discipline plan, They're going to take more responsibility for their behavior because they co-created the plan. If it's just dictated to them, which is how we usually roll as parents, they don't buy in. They don't take any responsibility for their behavior. They never agreed to the discipline plan. And so it's rife with conflict potential. And I think it's always good to think about the fact that where there's challenge, there's opportunity for growth. When your kid bumps up against behavior challenges, it's an obstacle in their developmental growth. We want to help them get past it. We don't want to just sort of punish it away. Keep in mind as well, when we use negative consequences, it only tells our child what they did wrong. It doesn't tell them what we want them to do. Right? Getting back to the idea of the definition of discipline being teaching. And so we want to empower our kids. And then I don't know why, but I added this to the slide. I don't know. It's too much technology perhaps, but empowerment, very important. Think about your child as the Copilot. We never do this. We always have the burden of figuring everything out about our kids on our own and then just sort of dictating it to them. What a mistake. And it's tough. Use your child as co-pilot. Engage them in the conversation. Engage them in ideas for the solution. If it's about their behavior, they need to be engaged. Otherwise, the progress is going to be very, very slow. And as I said before, it's going to help them to develop critical problem solving and coping skills that are going to help them throughout their life. Brief story. Years ago, I met with a mom who had a son in college. She was a teacher. Throughout his schooling, she helped him, quote unquote, with his schooling. Then he went away to college, gave her a call one day and said, oh, by the way, I'm failing half my classes. And she came to me for a consult. And, I wish I would have met her son when he was a little boy in second grade versus in college. But the advice that I gave her is to talk about this very calmly with her son, let her son know that she's paying for college, but it's his responsibility to get decent grades. And that if he doesn't get decent grades, then, well, she's not going to be able to pay for college anymore. She had that conversation with her son. He continued to get bad grades. She stopped paying. He dropped out of school. He went to work. And as some of you may recall, when you were at that point in your life, school seems bad, but work seems so much worse. And so that was his experience too. He hated it, making low pay somewhere, doing some obnoxious task. And so he went back to school and became more successful. She empowered him. He needed it, even though he had to go to the school of hard knocks, as I like to call it. But we all have to go there, right? We all learn from our mistakes. Again, it would have been nice to help them a lot sooner, but it's just an example of empowerment and how it can work. I appreciate your participation. I have another calming slide for you. Just do some breathing. Look at that beautiful water. I want to take a moment now, and I know we started a little late. I apologize again for the weird technological problems we had, but I want to go back to some of the questions that you've asked on the chat box. So I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way up. I'm seeing that we have a question. My son does not seem to understand the warnings. So we've given the consequence and not back down. Will he eventually understand the warning? He's 10 and still does not understand. If he does the right thing, then it will be at his advantage. He screamed at me, consequences don't work. I really encourage you to reflect on how much empowerment has gone on with your son. How much of a voice has he had in the discipline plan? How much of a voice has he had in the consequences? I think that's your next step. At a positive moment, right? Have that conversation with your 10-year-old and just share with them in as calm a way as you can some specific behavior that you've continued to chip away at that hasn't changed at all, and what you can do together. How can you support your son in terms of this? And again, when we talk about consequences and think about sending me an email to get that book, we want those consequences to be effective. And if they're things that we've decided that our kids would like, they're not going to work over time. Your child has to be involved in figuring out the consequences. And again, at 10, I would strongly encourage you to consider using activity-based consequences, where when he engages in the appropriate behavior, something really fun that he wants to do will happen, some fun activity. Think about how that will help to strengthen your relationship with your son too, right? Instead of it always being arguments, always being conflict, this gives us an opportunity to do something positive together, for him to earn it, to feel good, to learn how to behave correctly, then only to be told what he's doing is wrong. And I think that you'll see some shifts there, assuming that there's no big underlying issue like we talked about at the beginning. Another question from Michelle. How much change should you expect at once? I need my 12-year-old to become more responsible for herself in many ways, getting up on time, being ready to leave for school on time, managing her time to get homework done. What if they say, I don't know, when asked how they can help things get better? You brainstorm with your child, like we taught. You do it at a positive moment, not when you're late for school and everything's happening, which is usually when we have the conversation. And if your child doesn't have any suggestions, you can certainly offer a few. You can say, how can I support you in this? And take it a step at a time. Don't take everything. Don't make it about time management per se, but pick the one time management issue that is sort of not just most important, but most likely to be amenable to change. So maybe it's just working on the time frame around getting homework done, or just working on getting ready to leave for school. Take it a little piece at a time. Experience success with that first before moving on to the next one. Another mistake that parents make is they focus on too many behaviors at the same time. And that's a recipe for disaster. I like to focus on one behavior, maybe two at the most, and get some real benefit there. And then we can move on and work on some other things as well. Looking at the chat box here, somebody understood what I said about asking 5 times and moving to 3. It's wise. A new question that just came in. What can be done in the heat of a temper tantrum to diffuse the situation without giving the child their way? The trick with anger management is to help them develop strategies so that they can use them. In the middle of the tantrum, the best thing you can do, as we talked about, is seem calm, disengaged, and say an assertive statement. Say, boy, I can see you're really upset. I wish that wasn't the case. But as soon as you calm down, let's talk about it because I'd really like to help. And then walk away. If you stay engaged, chances are the child is going to get something out of it. They're going to get reinforced. If nothing else, seeing how it triggers a parent. Keep in mind, kids are not powerful. And when they see the power of they can upset their parent, it's very reinforcing. And so if there's no reinforcement to that temper tantrum, it will stop. And so we have to think about that. We have to think about it behaviorally. What's going on after that tantrum that's reinforcing the behavior, and how can we change it? I hope that makes sense. Another person wrote, my big power struggle is overdoing homework. My kids would rather play than on their iPads. We talked about that, the idea of work before play. Simple idea, but man, so important in terms of behavioral strategies. Looking up here, I'm not seeing anything else except early complaints about our technology. I'm with you on that. I don't know if you're still with us, Jim, but nice to see you joining from Forest Heights. And here's somebody that said something early on. I have 18-year-old and 13-year-old boys. The oldest is ready to be dependent, is a procrastinator, which drives us crazy. The youngest shuts down when getting too personal. So just finding a fine line when to step in and when to butt out, and how much should be expected of them as a family member. Sometimes, when we have these kind of family issues at home, family conversations are nice. Again, at a positive moment when things are going well. But for me, I would kind of focus on which child do we want to focus on first. I'd come up with some of the strategies that we've talked about today and put them to use. Your oldest child is ready to be independent. I hope that he or she has, or he in this case, has the skills needed. The procrastination factor is very important, something that he's going to have to deal with because it's going to continue to plague him. And again, it's strategic, and it's offering some little steps, to break the procrastination. And I would start with something really easy and generate some confidence in your son that he can be less of a procrastinator when he puts his mind to it, and then build on that with some of the tougher issues that are more easily vulnerable to procrastination. And then, talking about your younger son shutting down when it gets too personal. Boys and men in our culture are, told that they shouldn't express their feelings. It's a horrible thing that we do with our kids. I don't know why we do that, but we do. And it's still that way. And so we want to really help our kids to be emotive, to talk about their feelings, to feel comfortable about emotion. A lot of kids that don't do that run into problems actually with anger because their negative feelings build, and then they have these periodic explosions. And so helping our child to be more in touch with their feelings is very important. I think that answers all your questions. I hope this was helpful. Thanks again for your participation. And I look forward to speaking to you soon. Happy parenting.